Mercy Daniels knelt on the plantation porch, her hands moving in practiced circles across leather boots that belonged to a man who owned her body but could never touch her soul. The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly that afternoon in 1840, and she hummed a tune her grandmother taught her, a song about a river that ran all the way to freedom. She didn't know that by morning those boots would sit unpolished and abandoned, while her own worn shoes would become legend. She didn't know that travelers would speak of those shoes for generations, swearing they moved in the night as though Mercy still walked the earth. She didn't know that her name would be whispered in kitchens and fields, a ghost story and a hope wrapped into one. But as she set down the brush and stared toward the tree line where the forest met the cotton fields, one question burned in her mind like a brand. Could one woman's desperate choice become a doorway between captivity and a freedom so complete that even death couldn't chain it down? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Blackwood plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of red Georgia clay, a kingdom of cotton and cruelty where 200 souls labored under the weight of chains, both visible and invisible. Augustus Blackwood ruled this domain with the same cold calculation his father had before him, treating human beings as machinery that required only enough maintenance to keep producing. His wife, Constance, managed the house slaves with a different kind of tyranny, one dressed in silk and perfumed with rosewater, but no less absolute in its power over lives that could be bought and sold like cattle. Mercy Daniels had lived her entire 23 years on this land, born in a cabin behind the main house during a storm so fierce it tore shingles from the roof and sent the overseer's horse bolting into the night. Her mother, Ruth, worked in the kitchen, and her father, whose name she barely remembered, had been sold south when she was 4 years old to pay Augustus Blackwood's gambling debts. The memory of him existed only in fragments, a deep voice singing in the evening, strong hands lifting her above his head, the smell of tobacco and sweat that meant safety before she understood that safety was a luxury afforded to very few in their world. She grew up in the shadow of the main house, learning early that invisibility was survival, that silence could save you from the whip, and that hope was dangerous but impossible to completely extinguish. Her grandmother, old Dessa, had been brought from Africa on a slave ship when she was just 15. And though her body had been broken by decades of forced labor, her spirit remained fierce and untamed. It was Dessa who taught Mercy about the stars, about which ones pointed north, about the moss that grew on the northern side of trees, about the underground river of people who helped runaways find their way to places where chains were forbidden by law, if not always by custom. On that particular day in late September of 1840, Mercy sat on the porch steps as she had done countless times before, working her way through the family's collection of boots and shoes. The task was mindless enough that her thoughts could wander, dangerous enough that she had to remain alert for Constance Blackwood's sharp voice calling her to some other duty. The air hung thick and heavy with the promise of rain, and in the distance she could hear the field hands singing as they worked, their voices rising and falling in patterns that carried messages the white folks never understood. Augustus Blackwood had left that morning for Savannah on business, taking his eldest son Clayton with him. They wouldn't return for 3 days, maybe 4 if the cotton factors kept them negotiating prices and terms. Constance had taken to her bed with one of her headaches, the kind that required absolute silence in the house and left the servants walking on tiptoe through their duties. Young Miss Caroline, the Blackwood daughter who had just turned 16, had gone visiting with the overseer's wife, leaving the plantation quieter than usual, suspended in that peculiar stillness that comes before a storm. Mercy's hands moved automatically across the leather, her mind elsewhere, traveling paths she had walked only in imagination. She thought about the stories old Dessa told, about people who had run and made it, about a woman named Harriet who had escaped and then come back again and again to lead others out. She thought about her mother, Ruth, whose hands were scarred from years of kitchen work, whose back bore the marks of a whipping she'd received for burning a roast when Mercy was 10. She thought about her younger brother, Isaac, who had been sold away just 6 months ago when he dared to look the overseer in the eye, and whose absence left a hole in her chest that never stopped aching. The sun moved slowly across the sky, marking time with shadows that stretched and shifted across the porch boards. Mercy finished the last pair of boots and stood, her knees stiff from kneeling, her back tight from bending. She gathered the polished shoes and carried them inside, moving through the house with the practiced stealth of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, counting down seconds that felt both infinite and desperately short. In the kitchen, her mother was preparing the evening meal, her movements economical and precise despite the heat that made the room feel like standing inside a furnace. Ruth looked up as Mercy entered, and something passed between them. A wordless communication that mothers and daughters develop when speaking freely is too dangerous. Ruth's eyes held a question, and Mercy gave the smallest shake of her head. Not yet. Not today. But soon. Always soon. That evening after the family had eaten and the dishes had been washed and put away. After the candles had been lit and extinguished throughout the house, after Constance Blackwood had taken her laudanum and retreated into drugged sleep, Mercy sat outside her cabin and looked at the stars. Old Dessa sat beside her, her ancient body wrapped in a thin shawl despite the lingering warmth of the day, her eyes still sharp despite their cloudiness. "You thinking about running?" Dessa said, and it wasn't a question. Mercy didn't answer immediately. The night insects sang around them, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out its lonely hunting cry. "I'm thinking about Isaac," she finally replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm thinking about Mama's hands. I'm thinking about living and dying in the same place I was born, never knowing anything else." Dessa nodded slowly, her head moving in that deliberate way very old people have. "Your granddaddy, he tried to run once. They caught him before he made it 10 miles. Beat him so bad he couldn't work for a month. But you know what he told me before he died? He said those 10 miles of freedom were worth every scar on his back. Said for those few hours he belonged to himself, and that was a feeling worth dying for." "Did you ever think about running?" Mercy asked, though she'd heard the answer before. "Every day of my life, child, every single day. But I had babies, and I couldn't leave them, and by the time they'd grown, my body was too broken to carry me far. But you," Dessa reached out and took Mercy's hand in her own gnarled fingers. "You're young and strong, and you ain't got babies tying you down. You got a chance." Mercy felt tears burning in her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "Mama," she whispered. "Your mama would want you free more than she wants you safe," Dessa said firmly. "She'd never say it out loud, but I know my daughter. She's been dying a little bit every day since they sold Isaac. You running, you finding freedom, that would give her something to live for, something to hope for." They sat in silence after that, and eventually Dessa shuffled back to her own cabin, leaving Mercy alone with the stars and her thoughts. The night grew deeper, and the plantation settled into its uneasy sleep, the kind where every sound might be danger, where rest never fully came because vigilance was the price of survival. Mercy didn't sleep at all that night. She lay on her narrow pallet and stared at the ceiling, thinking about everything she would leave behind and everything she might gain. She thought about the stories of people who had run and been caught, about the dogs and the guns and the men who made their living hunting human beings like animals. She thought about the scars that runaways carried for the rest of their lives, the missing fingers and toes, the brands and mutilations meant to mark them forever as property that had tried to steal itself. But she also thought about the North Star, about cities where black people walked free, about working for wages and keeping them, about learning to read without fear of punishment, about having a name that belonged to her and not to a man who could sell her on a whim. She thought about waking up in the morning and choosing her own path for the day, about the simple dignity of being recognized as a human being with a soul and a mind and rights that others had to respect. As the first light of dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Mercy made her decision. She rose from her pallet and dressed in the darkness, putting on her sturdiest dress, the one with the fewest holes and the strongest seams. She wrapped a scrap of cloth around the little bit of food she'd been saving. Cornbread and a piece of salt pork, nothing that would be missed. She had no money because enslaved people weren't allowed to have money. Nothing of value because enslaved people weren't allowed to own anything. No map because enslaved people weren't taught to read. But she had something more valuable than any of those things. She had old Dessa's knowledge passed down in whispers and songs, coded directions that pointed toward freedom. She had her own strength and determination, forged in years of surviving a system designed to break her. And she had that most dangerous and precious of all possessions. She had hope. Before she left her cabin, Mercy did something that would later become legend. She took off the worn shoes she'd been given by the plantation. Shoes that were too small and pinched her feet. Shoes that had walked only in circles around the property that served as her prison. She set them down carefully on the ground outside her door, positioning them with deliberate precision so that their toes pointed away from the main house, away from the fields, away from everything she'd ever known. They pointed toward the tree line and the forest beyond, toward the horizon and whatever lay past it, toward a future she could barely imagine but desperately needed to believe in. Then, barefoot and carrying nothing but her small bundle of food, Mercy Daniels walked away from the only home she'd ever known. The morning was still dark enough to provide cover, and she moved quickly but carefully, knowing that haste could lead to mistakes that would cost her everything. She skirted the edge of the cotton fields where the plants stood in neat rows like soldiers guarding the wealth they produced. Past the overseer's house where the man who wielded the whip slept with his wife and children. Past the barn where the horses stamped and shifted in their stalls. Past the smokehouse and the tool shed and all the infrastructure of a system built on human suffering. The forest welcomed her with the scent of pine and rich earth, and as she crossed that invisible boundary between captivity and the possibility of freedom, something shifted inside her chest. She was still on Blackwood land, still in terrible danger, still more likely to be caught and punished than to succeed in her escape. But for the first time in her life, she was choosing her own direction. For the first time in her life, the next moment belonged to her alone. She ran then, her bare feet finding purchase on the forest floor, her breath coming quick and hard. Her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird desperate to escape its cage. The trees closed around her, ancient pines and oaks that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more, witnesses to countless stories of human struggle and survival. The light grew stronger as dawn broke fully, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and Mercy Daniels became something she had never been before. She became a fugitive. Back at the plantation, Ruth rose in the pre-dawn darkness as she did every morning, her body moving through familiar routines even as her mind remained foggy with sleep. She lit the kitchen fire and began preparing breakfast for the family, not yet aware that her daughter had vanished into the woods. It was old Dessa who discovered the abandoned shoes first, standing in front of Mercy's empty cabin with tears streaming down her weathered face, knowing exactly what those carefully positioned shoes meant. Dessa didn't raise an alarm. She went about her morning tasks with deliberate slowness, buying Mercy every possible minute of head start. It was nearly mid-morning before Constance Blackwood, emerging from her laudanum haze, called for Mercy to bring her breakfast tray, and received no response. The overseer was summoned, the cabins were searched, and the discovery was made. Mercy Daniels had run. The plantation exploded into activity. The overseer, a brutal man named Crenshaw, gathered his dogs and his hunting party. Messages were sent to neighboring plantations to watch for a runaway slave girl, 23 years old, medium height, with a scar on her left hand from a childhood burn. Notices would be printed and posted in every town within 100 miles, offering a reward for her capture and return, dead or alive, but preferably alive so she could be made an example of. Ruth stood in the kitchen and knew her daughter was gone, felt it in her bones the same way she'd felt it when Isaac was led away in chains. But unlike that day when grief had brought her to her knees, she felt something else now alongside the fear and the pain. She felt pride. Her daughter had chosen freedom over safety, had stepped into the unknown rather than accept a life of servitude. Whatever happened next, Mercy had claimed her own life for herself, and that was something no one could ever take away. Meanwhile, Mercy moved through the forest with a speed born of desperation and determination. She followed the lessons old Dessa had taught her, staying close to water when she could to confuse the dogs, heading always north by watching the sun's position and remembering the star patterns from the night before. Her feet grew cut and bloody on the rough terrain, but she barely noticed the pain. The sound of baying hounds in the distance pushed her forward even when her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out. She knew the dogs would come. She knew men on horses would follow. She knew the entire machinery of slavery would turn its attention to finding her and dragging her back to make an example of her defiance. But she also knew that every mile she put between herself and the plantation was a mile closer to freedom, and she would run until she couldn't run anymore. The first day passed in a blur of movement and fear. She drank from streams and forced herself to eat a little of her meager food supply, even though fear had killed her appetite. When darkness fell, she didn't stop but continued moving, using the stars to guide her through the black forest. She stumbled over roots and rocks, scraped herself on branches and thorns, but she didn't stop. On the second day, exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced, she finally allowed herself to rest in a hollow beneath an overturned tree. She slept fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, her body tense and ready to run again at the first sign of danger. When she woke in the afternoon, she heard something that made her blood run cold, the distant sound of dogs baying on a trail, getting closer. She ran again, pushing her battered body beyond what seemed possible, driven by the primal fear of capture. The dogs sounded closer now, their voices carrying through the trees with terrible clarity. She could hear men shouting to each other, coordinating their search, closing in on her position. Her mind raced through her options, and she did the only thing she could think of. She found a stream and waded into it, following it upstream for over a mile, her feet numb in the cold water, her dress soaked and heavy until the sound of the dogs began to fade into the distance. She had bought herself time, but she knew it wouldn't last. They would find where she'd left the stream eventually, would circle around and pick up her trail again. But night was falling, and darkness was her ally. She pulled herself from the water and continued north, her teeth chattering, her body shaking with cold and exhaustion, but her will unbroken. On the third night, half-starved and barely able to walk, she stumbled upon something that seemed impossible. A small cabin deep in the forest with a single candle burning in the window. She approached cautiously, knowing it could be a trap, knowing that trusting anyone could mean death or worse. But she was at the end of her strength, and the light drew her forward like a moth to flame. An old white woman answered her knock, her face lined with age and something that might have been kindness. They looked at each other for a long moment, and then the woman stepped aside and gestured for Mercy to enter. Inside the simple one-room cabin, the woman gave her food and water, tended to her bleeding feet, and spoke in a low voice about the route north, about safe houses in dangerous towns, about river crossings and roads to avoid. "You're not the first to come through here," the woman said. Her name was Abigail, and she'd been widowed young and lived alone ever since. "Won't be the last. I can give you 2 days to rest and heal, but then you have to move on. The patrollers come through here sometimes, and I can't protect you if they decide to search my place." Mercy stayed those 2 days, regaining some of her strength, letting her feet begin to heal. Abigail gave her better shoes, sturdier clothes, a little more food for the journey. She also gave her something even more valuable: hope that the network of people helping runaways was real, that there were those who risked everything to help strangers find freedom. On the morning of the 4th day since her escape, Mercy left Abigail's cabin and continued north. The old woman had drawn her a rough map in ashes on the cabin floor, memorizing it before wiping it away, showing her where to find the next safe house, how to identify the people who would help her. It was dangerous knowledge, deadly if she was caught with it, but it was also her best chance of survival. The weeks that followed were a blur of hiding and running, of kind strangers and narrow escapes, of cold nights and hungry days. She traveled mostly in darkness, sleeping in barns and haystacks, in forest hollows and under bridges. She crossed rivers that nearly drowned her, and walked roads where every approaching rider might be the one who recognized her as property, not a person. She met others on the road, other runaways traveling north, and sometimes they journeyed together for a while before separating to improve their chances. She heard stories of people who had made it all the way to Canada, of communities of free black people living without fear, of lives built on their own terms. These stories sustained her when her body wanted to give up, when the hunger and cold and constant fear threatened to break her spirit. In a town in Tennessee, she worked for 3 weeks in the home of a Quaker family, earning a little money and regaining her strength. They taught her to read basic words, showed her maps of the routes north, connected her with others in the network. When she left, she carried letters of introduction to families further along the route, codes that would identify her as someone worthy of help. In Kentucky, she had her closest call. A slave catcher recognized something in her bearing, but something that marked her as a runaway despite the free papers the Quakers had forged for her. She ran through city streets with men chasing her, ducked into a church where the minister hid her in the cellar for 2 days while the hunters searched the town. When she emerged, her hair had been cut short and she wore men's clothing, another disguise to help her slip past those who hunted human beings for profit. Winter came hard that year, and she nearly froze to death in a snowstorm in Ohio, saved only by a farmer who found her collapsed beside his barn and brought her inside to thaw by his fire. He was German and spoke broken English, but his wife fed her hot soup and gave her a coat that had belonged to their son who had died of fever the year before. They asked no questions about where she'd come from or where she was going, simply helped her because helping was the right thing to do. By the time spring arrived, Mercy Daniels was so far from the Blackwood plantation that she could almost believe she'd left that life behind entirely. She'd learned to read simple signs and documents, learned to talk to white people with the careful deference that kept her safe, learned which stars to follow and which roads to avoid. She'd become something new, no longer just an escaped slave, but a person forging her own identity in a world that still wanted to deny her humanity. She crossed into Canada on a warm day in April of 1841. 7 months after she'd left her shoes pointing toward the horizon. The man who helped her across the border was a black man named Benjamin Crawford, who had made the journey himself years before. And when he told her she was free now, truly free, she collapsed to her knees and wept for the first time since she'd left her mother behind. Benjamin helped her to her feet, his calloused hands gentle on her arms, and led her to a small settlement where other formerly enslaved people had gathered to build new lives. The community consisted of about 40 families living in modest homes they'd constructed themselves. Farming land they actually owned, raising children who would never know the crack of a whip or the terror of being sold away from their parents. It was a sight Mercy had never imagined possible. Black people living free and unmolested, going about their daily lives with the same casual confidence that white people took for granted. The first few weeks were overwhelming. Simple things that other people did without thinking felt strange and new to her. Walking down a street without moving aside for white people, looking someone in the eye when they spoke to her, making decisions about her own time and labor. The absence of constant fear was almost harder to adjust to than the fear itself had been, because she kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to reveal that this freedom was temporary or conditional or a cruel joke. A woman named Sarah Wellington took Mercy into her home those first weeks, giving her a place to sleep and helping her adjust to her new reality. Sarah had escaped from Virginia 12 years earlier and understood the particular disorientation that came with sudden freedom after a lifetime of bondage. She was patient with Mercy's nightmares, with her tendency to wake before dawn out of habit, with the way she flinched at sudden movements or loud noises. "Takes time," Sarah told her one morning as they prepared breakfast together. "Your body knows you're free, but your mind needs to catch up. Some days you'll forget you're not enslaved anymore, and some days you'll remember and it'll feel like a miracle all over again. Both of those things are normal." Sarah's husband, Joseph, was a carpenter who had been born free in Pennsylvania and moved to Canada to escape the increasingly restrictive laws being passed in the United States. He taught Mercy about the community, about how they governed themselves through regular meetings where everyone had a voice, about the challenges they faced and the triumphs they celebrated. He also offered to teach her to read and write properly, beyond the basic skills she'd picked up during her journey north. Mercy threw herself into learning with the intensity of someone who understood that literacy was power, that being able to read documents and signs and newspapers meant never having to depend entirely on others for information. She practiced her letters by candlelight after long days of work, copying passages from the Bible and old newspapers that Joseph brought home, sounding out words until they made sense, slowly assembling the building blocks of written language. Within 3 months, she could read simple texts on her own. Within 6 months, she was reading newspapers and following the political debates about slavery in the United States. Within a year, she could write letters, though she had no one to send them to. Her family was still enslaved in Georgia, and attempting to contact them would only put them in danger. She found work with a seamstress named Mrs. Patterson, a Scottish immigrant who asked no questions about Mercy's past and paid fair wages for skilled work. Mercy had learned basic sewing on the plantation, mending clothes and hemming garments. But Mrs. Patterson taught her finer techniques, how to create intricate stitching, and how to construct garments from patterns. The work was demanding but satisfying in a way plantation labor had never been, because at the end of each week, Mercy received coins that belonged to her, money she could save or spend as she chose. She saved almost everything she earned. The act of accumulating money felt revolutionary, each coin a tangible proof that she controlled her own labor and its fruits. She kept her savings in a small box under the floorboards of the room she eventually rented, counting the coins on Sunday evenings and planning for a future that belonged to her alone. The community welcomed her but didn't pry into her past. Everyone there had their own stories of escape and survival, their own scars, visible and invisible, their own reasons for seeking refuge in a place where slavery was illegal, and black people had at least some measure of protection under the law. They gathered for church services on Sundays, singing hymns that carried echoes of the spirituals from the plantations. but with new verses about freedom and hope. They celebrated holidays together, helped each other through illnesses and hardships, and created something that resembled family among people who had often been torn from their blood relatives. Mercy made friends slowly, cautiously, unused to trusting people or letting them close. But gradually she formed bonds with other women in the community. There was Margaret, who had escaped from Maryland with her 3 children and worked as a laundress. There was Rachel, who had been born free in New York but moved to Canada after her husband was kidnapped by slave catchers and sold south. There was Elizabeth, who rarely spoke about her past but whose back bore scars so thick they looked like ropes beneath her dress. These women understood things that didn't need to be spoken. They understood the nightmares and the sudden paralyzing fear that could strike in the middle of an ordinary day. They understood the guilt of having escaped when so many others remained in bondage. They understood the complicated grief of being free while your family was enslaved, the way joy and sorrow could exist in the same moment, inseparable and equally true. In her 2nd year in Canada, Mercy began attending meetings of the local anti-slavery society, a group of formerly enslaved people and white abolitionists who raised money to help refugees and advocated for the complete abolition of slavery. She listened to speakers describe the growing tensions in the United States, the increasing violence between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces, the court cases and legislative battles that would determine whether slavery would expand into new territories or be contained and eventually eliminated. She heard Frederick Douglass speak when he visited Toronto in 1843. His powerful voice describing the horrors of slavery and the hypocrisy of a nation that claimed to value freedom while holding millions in bondage. She sat in the audience and wept as he spoke, recognizing her own story in his words, feeling less alone in her pain and her anger and her determination to see slavery destroyed. Inspired by his example, Mercy began to speak at smaller gatherings, telling her own story of escape. At first, she could barely get through it without her voice breaking, but over time she learned to channel her emotions into persuasive testimony. She described the daily humiliations and cruelties of slavery, the constant fear, the arbitrary violence, the way the system destroyed families and crushed spirits. She described her escape and the people who had helped her, careful never to mention names or specific locations that might endanger the networks that continued to help others flee. Her testimony was powerful precisely because it was personal and specific. She didn't speak in abstractions about the evils of slavery, but in concrete details about what it meant to be someone else's property, to have no control over your own body or future, to watch your brother sold away and know you might never see him again. White audience members who had never experienced slavery sometimes wept at her descriptions, and formerly enslaved people in the audience nodded recognition of shared trauma. The speaking engagements paid a little money which she added to her savings. But more importantly, they gave her a sense of purpose beyond simple survival. She was contributing to the larger fight against slavery, keeping the issue alive in people's minds, making it harder to ignore or dismiss. Each time she spoke, she felt like she was honoring her mother and old Dessa and Isaac and all the people still suffering under the system she'd escaped. In 1845, 5 years after her escape, Mercy bought a small house on the outskirts of the settlement. It was modest, just 2 rooms and a small kitchen, but it was hers. She owned the deed with her name on it, Mercy Freeman, the surname she'd chosen for herself to replace the name of the man who had claimed to own her. The day she moved in, she stood in the empty front room and cried tears of joy and disbelief. A house. Her own house. Something no one could take away from her. She planted a garden behind the house, growing vegetables and herbs and flowers. The act of cultivating the land for her own benefit, of eating food she had grown herself through her own free labor, never lost its sense of miracle. She thought often of the cotton fields in Georgia, the endless rows of white bowls picked by hands that received nothing for their labor, and she thanked God or fate or the universe that she was no longer part of that system. She thought about her mother constantly. Ruth would be in her 50s now if she was still alive. Did she still work in the kitchen at the Blackwood plantation, or had age and hard labor rendered her unable to continue? Did she ever speak of her missing daughter, or was it too painful to mention? Did she believe Mercy had made it to freedom, or did she fear the worst? Mercy composed letters to her mother in her mind, telling her about the house and the garden, about learning to read and write, about the community she'd found and the life she'd built, but she never wrote them down because there was no safe way to send them. Any attempt to contact her family could expose them to punishment, or put the people who had helped her escape at risk. So she kept her words unspoken and her love unexpressed except in the privacy of her own heart. She thought about Isaac too, wondering what had become of him after he'd been sold away. He would be 21 now, a man grown, though she still pictured him as the 16-year-old boy who had been led away in chains. Was he alive? Was he being treated with any measure of humanity? Had he tried to escape? The not knowing was its own kind of torture, worse in some ways than certain bad news would have been. In 1848, the community was shaken by news of a raid on a settlement further west. Slave catchers, emboldened by new fugitive slave laws in the United States, had crossed into Canada and attempted to kidnap several formerly enslaved people to return them to their owners. The Canadian authorities had intervened and arrested the kidnappers, but the incident sent waves of fear through communities of refugees who had thought themselves safe. Mercy attended emergency meetings where people debated what to do. Some argued they should move further north, deeper into Canada, where they would be harder to reach. Others insisted they should stay and defend their homes, that running again would mean the slave catchers had won. Eventually, the community decided to stay, but to organize watches and warning systems, to ensure that any suspicious strangers would be reported immediately, and that everyone would be prepared to defend themselves and each other. The incident reminded Mercy that freedom was always contingent, always under threat from those who profited from slavery and were willing to break laws to maintain their power. It reinforced her commitment to the abolition movement, her determination to see slavery not just escaped from, but completely destroyed. She became more involved in the Underground Railroad, offering her home as a temporary shelter for refugees making their way north. She would wake in the middle of the night to find exhausted, terrified people on her doorstep sent by contacts further south who knew she could be trusted. She fed them, gave them places to sleep, tended their wounds, and helped them connect with others who could guide them to more permanent settlements. Each person who passed through her home carried their own story of suffering and survival. She heard about families separated, about children sold away from parents, about women sexually abused by masters and overseers, about men whipped nearly to death for minor infractions. She heard about daring escapes and narrow captures, about betrayals and unexpected kindnesses, about the thousand small and large cruelties that made up the daily reality of slavery. She also heard stories of resistance, stories of enslaved people who fought back against their oppressors, who sabotaged equipment and slowed their work, who learned to read despite laws forbidding it, who maintained their dignity and humanity in a system designed to strip both away. Stories of rebellions and uprisings, of people who chose death over continued enslavement, of communities that supported and protected each other even under the most difficult circumstances. These stories fed her spirit even as they broke her heart. They reminded her that she was part of a larger struggle, that resistance took many forms, that every person who refused to accept slavery's logic was fighting for freedom in their own way. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, making it easier for slave owners to reclaim people who had escaped to free states and requiring citizens to assist in capturing runaways. The law sent shockwaves through black communities across the North, and thousands of people who had thought themselves safe in free states fled to Canada to escape the new threat. The settlement where Mercy lived saw its population double within months as refugees poured across the border. The existing residents worked frantically to help the newcomers find housing and work, to integrate them into the community, to provide support and resources for people who often arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Mercy opened her home to a family of 4, a mother and father with 2 young daughters who had escaped from Kentucky just ahead of slave catchers who had tracked them to Cincinnati. The family stayed with her for 3 months while the father, a skilled blacksmith, established himself in the community and saved enough money to build his own small house. The mother, whose name was Hannah, had a beautiful singing voice, and on Sunday evenings, she would sing spirituals that made everyone weep with their beauty and their pain. The daughters, 6 and 8 years old, were the first free generation of their family, and watching them play without fear, watching them learn to read in the small school the community had established, watching them grow up knowing they would never be sold away from their parents gave Mercy a profound sense of hope. This was what freedom looked like. This was what they were all fighting for. During those years, Mercy also witnessed the complications and challenges of building a free black community. There were disputes over land and resources, disagreements about governance and priorities, tensions between different groups with different backgrounds and experiences. People who had been enslaved sometimes clashed with people who had been born free, their perspectives shaped by different realities. People from different regions had different customs and expectations that didn't always mesh smoothly. But they worked through these challenges because they had to. Because the alternative was to fail in building something that proved black people could govern themselves and create prosperous communities when given the chance. They held meetings and voted on decisions. They mediated disputes and found compromises. They created rules and systems that reflected their shared values even when individuals disagreed on specifics. Mercy served on various committees over the years, helping to organize the school, manage the community fund for emergencies, and coordinate support for new arrivals. She discovered she had a talent for administration and mediation, for finding solutions that satisfied multiple parties, for keeping records and managing resources. These were skills she never would have developed under slavery, where her intelligence and capabilities were seen as threatening rather than valuable. In 1854, she received news that shook her to her core. A woman who had recently escaped from Georgia brought word that Ruth Daniels had died 2 years earlier, passing in her sleep at the age of about 65. The woman had worked briefly on the Blackwood plantation, and remembered Ruth speaking of a daughter who had run away years before, who she believed had made it to freedom. Mercy grieved deeply for the mother she would never see again, for the reconciliation that would never happen, for the words of love and gratitude she would never get to speak in person. She grieved for the life her mother had lived, for the decades of hard labor and pain, for the children she'd lost to death and sale and escape. She grieved for the injustice of a system that had used her mother's body for profit and then discarded her when she was no longer useful. But she also felt grateful that her mother had died believing her daughter was free. That in her final years, Ruth had carried the hope that Mercy's escape had succeeded, that at least one of her children had found a better life. That small comfort was something, even if it could never compensate for all they had lost. The woman also brought news that old Dessa had passed the year after Ruth, and that the Blackwood plantation was struggling financially as the national debate over slavery intensified and the Southern economy became increasingly unstable. This news gave Mercy a grim satisfaction. The system that had profited from her suffering was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, though not fast enough and not without enormous cost in human suffering. Around this time, Mercy began to write down her experiences. At first, she wrote just for herself, trying to process her memories and emotions, trying to make sense of her journey from slavery to freedom. But gradually, she realized her story might be valuable to others, both as testimony against slavery and as encouragement for those still fighting for their freedom. She wrote about her childhood on the plantation, about the small joys and large sorrows, about the lessons her mother and grandmother had taught her. She wrote about the decision to run, about the fear and desperation that had driven her, about the months of hiding and running and never feeling safe. She wrote about the people who had helped her, being careful to change names and locations to protect them. She wrote about arriving in Canada and slowly learning to live as a free person. Her writing was raw and honest, unpolished but powerful in its authenticity. She shared portions of it at anti-slavery meetings, and people encouraged her to expand it into a full narrative that could be published. Several formerly enslaved people had published their narratives in recent years, and these books had become important tools in the abolitionist movement, making the abstract evil of slavery concrete and personal in ways that statistics and arguments could not. Mercy worked on her manuscript for 2 years, writing and revising, adding details and context, trying to make people understand not just what had happened to her, but what it had felt like, how slavery had shaped every aspect of her existence, how freedom had transformed her sense of herself and her possibilities. In 1857, her narrative was published by a small abolitionist press in Toronto. It sold modestly but received positive reviews in anti-slavery newspapers and journals. The reviewer in one publication wrote that Mercy's straightforward, unflinching account of her experiences carried more moral weight than any philosophical argument against slavery, that reading her words made it impossible to pretend that enslaved people were anything other than fully human beings suffering under an inhumane system. The publication of her narrative brought Mercy a measure of recognition beyond her local community. She received invitations to speak at larger gatherings, and her testimony reached people who might never have otherwise heard from someone who had experienced slavery firsthand. She traveled to other Canadian cities and even ventured briefly into free states in the North, though always nervously, aware that the Fugitive Slave Act meant she could still theoretically be captured and returned to Georgia. During one speaking tour in 1858, she met a man named William Garrison, no relation to the famous abolitionist, who had escaped from Virginia 15 years earlier and now worked as a teacher in Montreal. He was intelligent and kind, with a gentle manner that reminded her slightly of her father. The little she remembered of him. They corresponded after her visit, letters that grew progressively more personal and intimate, sharing their thoughts about politics and philosophy and their hopes for the future. William proposed marriage in a letter, and Mercy seriously considered accepting. She cared for him deeply and respected him immensely. But ultimately she declined, and she struggled to articulate exactly why. Part of it was that she had grown accustomed to her independence, to making decisions without having to consider a partner's needs or desires. Part of it was that her work for the abolitionist cause felt incompatible with the domestic responsibilities of marriage. Part of it was something less definable, a sense that her life belonged to a larger purpose, that she had been spared for a reason, and that reason didn't include the conventional markers of women's happiness like husband and children. William accepted her refusal gracefully, and they remained friends and correspondents for the rest of their lives. He married someone else 2 years later, and Mercy attended the wedding and felt genuinely happy for him, though she also felt the sharp pang of the road not taken, the life she might have had but had chosen not to pursue. She settled in a small community of formerly enslaved people outside Toronto, finding work as a seamstress and slowly building a life that belonged entirely to herself. She learned to write her name, not the name Augustus Blackwood had given her, but a new name she chose for herself. She attended church where black people sat where they wanted, not in a segregated balcony. She walked down streets without stepping aside for white people, without lowering her eyes, without the constant calculation of survival that had defined her entire life. But she never forgot where she came from. At night, she dreamed of her mother and old Dessa, wondered if they were still alive, if they ever spoke of her, if they knew she'd made it to freedom. She dreamed of Isaac, sold away to some plantation she'd never see, wondered if he was still alive, if he was being treated well, if he ever thought about running like she had. She dreamed of the shoes she'd left behind, pointing toward the horizon like a compass or a prayer. Back in Georgia, those shoes had become something of a legend. Constance Blackwood had ordered them burned when Mercy's trail had gone cold and the hunt had been called off. But Ruth had rescued them from the fire, keeping them hidden in her cabin. And strange stories began to circulate among the enslaved people on the plantation and neighboring properties. Stories that those shoes sometimes moved in the night, that their toes still pointed north, that they were waiting for Mercy to return for them. Some said it was just the wind shifting them, or animals nosing around the cabin. Others believed old Dessa's spirit moved them, a reminder that freedom was still possible, still worth fighting for. The shoes became a symbol, a secret sign of hope passed from person to person in whispers and songs. When someone was thinking about running, they would say they were going to check on Mercy's shoes and everyone would know what they meant. Ruth lived 9 more years after her daughter's escape, working in the Blackwood kitchen until her hands finally gave out and she could no longer grip the heavy pots and pans. In her last days, she told everyone who would listen that Mercy had made it, that she knew it in her bones, that her daughter walked free somewhere far away. Whether she truly believed it or simply needed to believe it, no one could say. But the conviction in her voice convinced many others, and the legend of Mercy Daniels grew. Old Dessa outlived her daughter by 2 years, finally passing in her sleep at the age of 97. Her face peaceful in death, perhaps dreaming of the Africa she'd been stolen from, or perhaps dreaming of the granddaughter who had reclaimed what had been taken. At her funeral, the enslaved people sang the old songs in languages most of them had forgotten the meanings of. Songs of resistance and resilience, songs that connected them to ancestors who had survived and to descendants who would one day be free. The shoes remained in Ruth's old cabin, and after her death, they were moved to a new location by someone who understood their significance, hidden in a hollow tree, then later buried beneath a crossroads, then dug up and moved again. They became less actual objects and more mythology, a story that transformed with each telling, gathering meaning and power as the years passed. Some versions of the story said that Mercy's ghost walked the land, her spirit unable to rest until all enslaved people were free. Others said she'd become a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping others escape as she'd been helped. Still others claimed she'd married a free man and had children who grew up knowing nothing of slavery, who attended schools and owned property and lived lives their grandmother could barely have imagined. The truth was simpler and more profound. Mercy Daniels lived quietly in Canada for the rest of her life, working hard and saving her money, eventually buying a small house with a garden where she grew vegetables and flowers. She never married, though she had friends and a community that valued her. She learned to read well enough to devour newspapers following the growing tensions in America over slavery, reading about abolitionists and slave rebellions, about the increasing conflict between North and South. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, she was 44 years old, and she volunteered to help the war effort in any way she could. She sewed uniforms and rolled bandages, raised money for freed slaves who fled north during the conflict, opened her home to refugees who needed a place to stay. She read about the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and wept tears of joy mixed with sorrow. Joy for those who would be freed, sorrow that it had taken so much blood and death to achieve what should have been obvious from the start, that all people were created equal and deserved freedom. The news from the war zones was often devastating. Battles that left thousands dead, entire towns destroyed, families torn apart by violence and conflicting loyalties. But there was also news that filled her with hope. Stories of enslaved people fleeing to Union lines by the thousands, of black men enlisting to fight for their own freedom and that of their people, of plantations abandoned by owners who fled advancing Union armies. She followed the war news obsessively, reading every newspaper she could get her hands on, discussing developments with others in the community, trying to piece together what was happening in the chaos of the conflict. When she read about battles in Georgia, she wondered if the Blackwood plantation was affected, if Union troops had marched through that land where she had spent the first 23 years of her life, if the fields she had walked past on her escape were now battlefields soaked with blood. In 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, Mercy organized a celebration in her community that lasted 3 days. They held church services and community dinners, sang spirituals, and gave speeches about what this moment meant for their people. The proclamation had its limitations. It only freed enslaved people in rebel states, not in border states that had remained in the Union, and its power depended on Union military victory to be enforced. But it was still a monumental shift, a statement that the United States government finally recognized slavery as an evil that must be destroyed. During the celebration, Mercy spoke about her mother and grandmother, about Isaac, about all the people she had known who had died in slavery without ever tasting freedom. "This victory is for them," she told the assembled crowd, her voice strong despite the tears streaming down her face. "Every person freed by this proclamation, every child who will grow up knowing they can never be sold away from their parents, every man and woman who will work for wages instead of the whip, they represent the vindication of every person who suffered and died under slavery's curse. We must never forget what it cost to reach this moment." As the war continued, refugees from the fighting poured into Canada in even greater numbers. Mercy's home became a constant way station for people fleeing the violence, and she worked herself to exhaustion helping them find food, shelter, and work. She met people who had been freed by the advancing Union armies but had nowhere to go, no resources to sustain themselves. She met soldiers who had been wounded and needed care. She met children orphaned by the war, their parents killed in the fighting or lost in the chaos of displacement. Among the refugees was a young woman named Clara who had escaped from the Blackwood plantation in Georgia in 1863 when Union forces moved through the area. When Mercy learned where Clara was from, she could barely contain her emotions. She peppered the young woman with questions about the plantation, about what had happened there, about whether anyone remembered her or her family. Clara, who was only 19 and had been born after Mercy's escape, knew some of the stories. She told Mercy that the Blackwood plantation had indeed been affected by the war, that Augustus Blackwood had died of a heart attack in 1867 when he received news that Sherman's army was approaching, that his son Clayton had gone off to fight for the Confederacy and been killed at Gettysburg. She told her that Constance Blackwood had tried to maintain the plantation with a reduced labor force, but that as the Union armies drew closer, enslaved people had begun leaving in large numbers, simply walking away from a system that was collapsing around them. Most importantly, Clara told her about the shoes. The legend had persisted and even grown during the years since Mercy's escape. New versions of the story had emerged, some saying that Mercy's spirit protected runaway slaves, others claiming that anyone who found the shoes and pointed them toward freedom would successfully escape. The shoes themselves had taken on an almost religious significance, a physical connection to hope and liberation. Old Violet, she was one of the oldest folks on the plantation when I was growing up, Clara explained. She used to tell us about Mercy Daniels, about how she walked away barefoot and never looked back. She said Mercy's shoes were a promise that one day all of us would walk free. When the Union soldiers came through and told us we could leave, old Violet went to where those shoes were kept. She'd been taking care of them all those years, and she put them on even though they didn't fit her. She wore them for 3 days while we walked to the Union camps, and she said every step felt like Mercy was walking with her. Mercy wept as she listened to this story, overwhelmed by the knowledge that her desperate escape had meant something to people she'd never met, that her choice to run had given others hope and courage. She had left those shoes as an accident of departure, a practical decision to go barefoot in the forest rather than wear ill-fitting plantation shoes. She had never imagined they would become a symbol, a legend, a source of strength for others facing their own terrifying choices. Old Violet, is she? Mercy couldn't finish the question. She died that winter, Clara said softly. The Union camps were overcrowded and there wasn't enough food or medicine. A lot of the old folks didn't make it. But before she died, she told me to remember Mercy Daniels, to remember that we all got to choose our own path now, and that we should never let anyone take that choice away from us again. That conversation changed something in Mercy. She had always known intellectually that her story might inspire others, that her testimony at anti-slavery meetings served a purpose beyond her own healing. But hearing that her actions had directly impacted people on the Blackwood plantation, that the shoes she'd left behind had become a tangible symbol of hope, made her understand the power of individual resistance in a new way. Every person who stood up against slavery, who refused to accept it as inevitable or natural, who claimed their own humanity despite a system that denied it, they all contributed to its eventual destruction. After the war ended in 1865, the real work of reconstruction began. 4 million formerly enslaved people needed support and resources to build lives as free people. Schools needed to be established, land needed to be distributed, economic systems needed to be restructured. The challenges were enormous, and the resistance from white Southerners determined to maintain their supremacy was fierce and often violent. Mercy wanted desperately to go south and help with the reconstruction efforts. She imagined teaching in schools for freed people, helping them learn to read and write, sharing the knowledge she had gained. But she was approaching 50 years old, and the South was dangerous for anyone associated with Black empowerment. Reports of violence against teachers and activists filtered north regularly. Stories of schools burned, of people beaten or killed for the crime of helping formerly enslaved people claim their rights. Instead, she did what she could from Canada. She raised money for freedmen's schools, collected books and supplies to send south, wrote letters of encouragement and advice to teachers working in the former Confederate states. She opened her home to refugees who continued to flee north, escaping not slavery now but the violence of whites determined to reestablish dominance through terror and intimidation. She also began working on a second book. This one focused not on her own story but on the stories of others she had met during her years helping refugees on the Underground Railroad. She conducted interviews, collected testimonies, and wove them together into a tapestry of resistance and survival that documented the many ways people had fought against slavery. Some had fought with weapons, staging rebellions and uprisings. Others had fought with work slowdowns and sabotage. Still others had fought by maintaining their dignity and humanity in the face of dehumanizing treatment, by preserving family bonds despite forced separations, by passing down stories and skills and spiritual practices that connected them to ancestors and to each other. The book was published in 1870 and received even more attention than her first narrative. Reviewers praised it as an important historical document, a collection of voices that might otherwise have been lost to history. One reviewer wrote that the book demolished any remaining claims that enslaved people had been content with their condition, that it revealed the constant undercurrent of resistance that had always existed even when it couldn't be openly expressed. But the publication also brought threats. Pro-slavery sympathizers, bitter about the South's defeat and resentful of black people claiming equality, sent her threatening letters. Some promised violence if she ever set foot in the United States. Others simply spewed racist hatred, attempting to diminish her accomplishments and reassert white supremacy through vicious words. She was frightened by these letters but refused to be silenced by them. She had escaped slavery itself. She would not be cowed by the angry words of those who mourned its passing. The 1870s brought both progress and setbacks. The 14th and 15th Amendments granted citizenship and voting rights to black men, a victory Mercy celebrated even as she noted the exclusion of women from those new rights. Black men were elected to public office across the South, serving in state legislatures and even in Congress, proving their capability for self-governance despite centuries of propaganda claiming otherwise. But the progress was met with violent resistance. The Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations terrorized black communities, murdering activists and public officials, burning churches and schools, using violence to suppress black political participation. The federal government's commitment to protecting the rights of formerly enslaved people wavered and eventually failed as Northern whites tired of the effort and Southern whites reasserted control through legal and extra-legal means. Mercy watched these developments with growing frustration and anger. The war had ended slavery, but it had not ended racism or the determination of whites to maintain dominance over black people. The promised transformation of Southern society was being betrayed, and the brief period of black political power was being systematically destroyed. She had thought that slavery's end would lead inevitably to true equality, but she was learning that freedom was not a single achievement, but an ongoing struggle that would require continued resistance and sacrifice. In 1876, the disputed presidential election resulted in a compromise that effectively ended Reconstruction. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South, and black Southerners were left to face white supremacist violence with minimal federal protection. The gains of the previous decade began to erode rapidly as Southern states passed laws restricting black voting rights and imposing segregation. Mercy was 60 years old by then, and though her body was slowing down, her commitment to justice remained fierce. She continued speaking and writing, documenting the betrayal of Reconstruction and calling for renewed commitment to equality. She argued that the nation had a moral obligation to protect the rights it had granted, that abandoning black Southerners to violence and oppression made a mockery of the war's stated aims. But she also found herself reflecting more on her own journey, on the distance she had traveled from that morning in 1840 when she had walked away from the Blackwood plantation. She had lived long enough to see slavery end, a victory she had once thought impossible. Even if the promise of true equality remained unfulfilled, even if the fight continued, that was something. Slavery, the legal ownership of human beings, was finished in the United States. That achievement, bought with so much blood and suffering, could never be undone. She thought often about the shoes she had left behind, about the legend they had become. Clara's story about old Violet wearing them during her walk to freedom had stayed with Mercy, had become one of her most treasured memories even though she hadn't been there to witness it. The shoes had served a purpose beyond anything she had imagined. They had become a physical embodiment of hope, a way for enslaved people to connect with the possibility of freedom, when that possibility seemed impossibly distant. In 1882, a young historian visited Mercy, seeking to document the stories of formerly enslaved people before that generation passed away. The historian, a white woman named Julia Morrison, who taught at a women's college in Massachusetts, had read Mercy's books and wanted to conduct a more extensive interview about her experiences. They spent a week together, Julia asking careful questions and taking detailed notes while Mercy talked about her life on the plantation, her escape, her journey to Canada, and her decades of activism. Julia was particularly interested in the shoes, in how that detail had become such a powerful symbol. "Why did you take them off?" Julia asked. "Why not wear them for the journey?" Mercy thought about the question carefully before answering. "I think I wanted to leave something behind that said I had been there, that I had existed," she finally said. "Enslaved people, we were erased. We weren't supposed to have stories or desires or significance beyond our labor. Leaving the shoes, pointing them toward freedom, that was me saying I mattered. My choice mattered. My life mattered. And I wanted others to know that someone had walked away, that escape was possible." "Did you know they would become such a powerful symbol?" Julia asked. "No," Mercy said honestly. "I just knew I needed to go barefoot because those shoes would have slowed me down and hurt my feet. The rest, that happened without me. People needed something to believe in, and the shoes became that thing. I'm honored by it, humbled by it, but I didn't plan it." Julia's interviews were eventually published in a book about the Underground Railroad, and Mercy's story was featured prominently. The book brought renewed attention to her work and to the stories of other formerly enslaved people who had resisted the system in various ways. It also sparked a renewed search for the actual shoes, which had been lost sometime during or after the Civil War when the Blackwood plantation was abandoned. After the war ended, she thought about going back to Georgia, about finding out what had happened to her family, about seeing the plantation where she'd been born and raised. But she never did. The thought of returning to that place, even as a free woman, felt like stepping back into a nightmare she'd fought too hard to escape. Instead, she wrote letters to organizations helping formerly enslaved people, asking if anyone knew anything about Ruth Daniels or Isaac Daniels from the Blackwood plantation, but she never received any definitive answers. The search for the shoes became something of an obsession for some historians and collectors. They combed through the ruins of the Blackwood plantation, interviewed elderly people who remembered the war years, tried to trace what had happened to the physical objects that had taken on such symbolic weight. Some claimed to have found them, producing worn shoes they said matched the descriptions. But Mercy, when shown photographs of these supposed relics, could never say with certainty whether they were truly hers. She had worn them for such a short time, and her memory of them was overshadowed by what they had come to represent. "Does it matter if they're found?" she asked Julia Morrison during one conversation. The power of the shoes was never in the leather and stitching. It was in what they represented, the idea that someone could walk away from slavery toward freedom. That idea doesn't need physical shoes to exist. It lives in every person who refuses to accept injustice, who chooses dignity over safety, who points themselves toward a better future even when the path is unclear. In 1885, Mercy was 68 years old and beginning to feel the weight of her years. Her hands, which had performed so much labor over her lifetime, were gnarled with arthritis. Her eyesight was failing. making it difficult to read the newspapers she loved or to sew the fine stitches that had sustained her for decades. Her hearing was fading, though she would joke that this was sometimes a blessing, allowing her to ignore things she didn't want to hear. But her mind remained sharp, and her commitment to justice never wavered. She continued to speak at gatherings when her health permitted, though she could no longer travel far from her home. She mentored young activists who sought her advice, sharing the lessons she had learned over nearly 5 decades of fighting for freedom and equality. She wrote letters to newspapers protesting injustices, adding her voice to campaigns for voting rights and against lynching and segregation. She also began to think more seriously about her own mortality, about what would happen to her story after she was gone. She had published 2 books and given countless testimonies, but she worried that future generations might forget, that the specific horrors of slavery might fade into abstract history, that people might lose the visceral understanding of what it meant to be property, to have no control over your own body or future, to live in constant fear and pain. She decided to donate her papers, her letters, and manuscripts and notes to a library that collected materials related to abolitionism and the Black experience in North America. She spent months organizing her documents, adding context and explanation so that future researchers would understand what they were reading. It was painstaking work, made more difficult by her failing eyesight, but she persevered because she believed it mattered. Among the papers she donated was a journal she had kept sporadically over the years, recording her thoughts and observations about the struggle for freedom and equality. Reading back through it, she was struck by how much had changed and how much had remained stubbornly the same. Slavery was gone, but racism persisted. Black people had rights on paper, but those rights were constantly under attack and often went unenforced. Progress had been made, but it was always precarious, always subject to reversal. In one journal entry from 1868, she had written, "Freedom is not a gift someone gives you. It is something you claim for yourself and then defend every day for the rest of your life." My escape from the plantation was just the first step in a journey that will never end as long as people face oppression and injustice. The shoes I left pointing toward the horizon were not pointing toward a destination but toward a direction, a commitment to always move forward, to never accept that things cannot be better than they are. She liked that younger self's optimism and determination, and she tried to maintain both even as age and illness took their toll. In 1888, she suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed on her left side. She could no longer live independently, and friends from the community took turns caring for her, making sure she had food and company, reading to her from newspapers and books when her own eyes could no longer make out the words. Despite her physical limitations, she remained engaged with the world. She followed political developments, celebrated victories, and mourned defeats in the ongoing struggle for civil rights. She was particularly proud of the young people who continued the fight, who refused to accept segregation and disenfranchisement as permanent conditions. She told everyone who visited that the future belonged to them, that they had to carry forward the work that her generation had begun. In her final months, she spoke often of her mother and grandmother, of Isaac, of all the people she had known on the Blackwood plantation. She wondered if she would see them again in whatever came after death, if there would be a reunion in some place beyond suffering and injustice. She had never been entirely certain about the specifics of her religious beliefs, having seen too much suffering to accept simple explanations of divine justice. But she hoped there was something beyond this life, some place where the pain of this world was healed and the wrongs were made right. She lived to see the end of slavery in America, lived to see black men vote and hold office during Reconstruction, lived to see the backlash and violence that sought to reestablish white supremacy through different means. She lived to see the hope and the disappointment, the progress and the setbacks, the long, hard road toward justice that was nowhere near complete when she died in 1889 at the age of 72. The night before she died, she asked her caretaker to help her to the window so she could see the stars. She looked up at the North Star that had guided her escape so many years ago, and she smiled. "I walked free," she whispered. "I walked free, and I helped others walk free. That was enough. That was a good life." Her funeral was attended by dozens of people from the Black community in Toronto, people who remembered her quiet kindness, her willingness to help anyone who needed it, her stories about escaping slavery that inspired others to believe in their own strength. They sang the old spirituals that had sustained enslaved people through their suffering, but they sang them as free people now, their voices strong and defiant and hopeful. The minister spoke of her courage and her commitment to justice, of the legacy she left not just in her books and speeches, but in the lives of the countless people she had helped over the decades. She was buried in a cemetery where Black people and white people lay side by side, and her gravestone bore the name she'd chosen for herself and a simple inscription: "She walked free." It was exactly what she would have wanted, a statement of fact and a declaration of identity, a summary of what had mattered most in her life. Back in Georgia, the Blackwood plantation had long since fallen into decay. Augustus Blackwood lost everything during the Civil War, dying bitter and broken in 1867. The main house burned down in 1875, and the land was eventually divided and sold off to various buyers. The cabins where enslaved people had lived rotted away, reclaimed by forest and time, their histories forgotten by most. But the story of Mercy Daniels persisted, passed down through generations, changing and evolving with each telling. The shoes, whether real or legendary, became a symbol in Black folklore across the South, representing the hope of escape, the possibility of freedom, the courage to step into an unknown future rather than accept a certain misery. Parents told their children about Mercy's shoes when they needed courage, when they faced difficult choices, when they wondered if their dreams were possible. In the 1900s, as the first generation born after slavery's end came of age, the story took on new meanings. It became less about physical escape from bondage and more about the ongoing struggle for dignity and rights in a segregated society. When Black people faced discrimination and violence, they remembered that Mercy Daniels had walked away from injustice toward something better, and they drew strength from her example. A blues singer in Mississippi wrote a song about the shoes in 1922, describing them as having magical properties that helped travelers find their way to freedom. The song became popular in Black communities across the South, and the lyrics were adapted and changed as different musicians made it their own. Some versions were mournful, focusing on the pain of separation from family and home. Others were defiant, celebrating resistance and survival. All of them kept Mercy's name alive for a new generation. In the 1930s, a writer collecting folk tales in Georgia heard the story from an elderly man whose grandmother had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation. He wrote it down, publishing it in a collection of Southern ghost stories, and the tale of Mercy's shoes reached a wider audience. Some readers dismissed it as superstitious nonsense, but others recognized it for what it was: a survival story dressed in supernatural clothing, a reminder of the countless individuals who had risked everything for freedom. The writer, a white man named James Carlton, was fascinated by the way the story had evolved over nearly a century. In his introduction to the tale, he wrote, "The legend of Mercy Daniels' shoes reveals something profound about how oppressed people maintain hope in impossible circumstances. By transforming a simple pair of shoes into a magical talisman, enslaved people created a symbol that said their dreams of freedom were not just possible but inevitable." The shoes pointing toward the horizon became a compass for the spirit, a reminder that north existed even when you couldn't see it. That freedom existed even when you were surrounded by chains. She lived to see the end of slavery in America, lived to see black men vote and hold office during Reconstruction, lived to see the backlash and violence that sought to reestablish white supremacy through different means. She lived to see the hope and the disappointment, the progress and the setbacks, the long, hard road toward justice that was nowhere near complete when she died in 1889 at the age of 72. Her funeral was attended by dozens of people from the black community in Toronto, people who remembered her quiet kindness, her willingness to help anyone who needed it, her stories about escaping slavery that inspired others to believe in their own strength. She was buried in a cemetery where black people and white people lay side by side, and her gravestone bore the name she'd chosen for herself and a simple inscription: "She walked free." Back in Georgia, the Blackwood plantation had long since fallen into decay. Augustus Blackwood lost everything during the Civil War, dying bitter and broken in 1867. The main house burned down in 1875, and the land was eventually divided and sold off to various buyers. The cabins where enslaved people had lived rotted away, reclaimed by forest and time, their histories forgotten by most. But the story of Mercy Daniels persisted, passed down through generations, changing and evolving with each telling. The shoes, whether real or legendary, became a symbol in black folklore across the South, representing the hope of escape, the possibility of freedom, the courage to step into an unknown future rather than accept a certain misery. In the 1930s, a writer collecting folk tales in Georgia heard the story from an elderly man whose grandmother had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation. He wrote it down, publishing it in a collection of Southern ghost stories, and the tale of Mercy's shoes reached a wider audience. Some readers dismissed it as superstitious nonsense, but others recognized it for what it was: a survival story dressed in supernatural clothing, a reminder of the countless individuals who had risked everything for freedom. In the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, activists in Georgia searching for historical inspiration rediscovered the story. They found records of a slave named Mercy Daniels who had escaped from the Blackwood plantation in 1840 and was never recovered, a brief mention in an old newspaper offering a reward for her capture. They couldn't confirm whether she'd survived her escape, but they chose to believe she had, and her story became part of the larger narrative of black resistance and resilience. A folk singer wrote a song about her, about the shoes that pointed toward freedom, and it was sung at marches and rallies across the South. The lyrics spoke of walking barefoot toward a dream, of leaving behind markers for others to follow, of the long journey from slavery to something like justice. Young people facing police dogs and fire hoses found strength in the image of a woman who had walked away from everything she knew with nothing but hope to sustain her. In the 21st century, a historian researching the Underground Railroad found Canadian records showing that a woman named Mercy Freeman, formerly Mercy Daniels of Georgia, had lived in Toronto from 1841 until her death in 1889. The records included a brief oral history she'd given late in life, describing her escape and journey north. Reading those words, separated by more than a century from the events they described, the historian felt connected across time to a woman who had refused to accept the role society had assigned her. The shoes themselves, assuming they ever existed as actual physical objects and weren't always just metaphor and legend, were long gone. But their symbolic power remained, evolving with each generation that claimed the story as their own. They represented not just one woman's escape, but the universal human longing for freedom and dignity, the willingness to risk everything for a chance at a better life, the hope that even in the darkest circumstances change was possible. Today, there's a historical marker near the site where the Blackwood plantation once stood, erected by the local historical society in 2015. It tells the story of the plantation and the people who were enslaved there, including a brief mention of Mercy Daniels and her legendary escape. Tourists sometimes stop to read it, taking photos before moving on to the next attraction, most of them never fully grasping the weight of what happened in that place. But sometimes local people say, if you go there at dawn or dusk, when the light plays tricks and the shadows lie long across the ground, you can see impressions in the grass like footprints leading away from the marker and into the forest. Some dismiss this as nothing more than patterns in the vegetation or the play of light and shadow. Others see it as Mercy's spirit still walking, still free, still moving forward. The truth is probably simpler and more complex than any legend can capture. Mercy Daniels was a real woman who made a real choice in desperate circumstances, who walked away from slavery toward an uncertain future, who survived through a combination of courage, luck, help from others, and sheer stubborn determination. She wasn't superhuman or magical, just human, which made her courage all the more remarkable. Her shoes, whether they moved on their own or stayed exactly where she placed them, served their purpose. They marked the moment when one woman decided that freedom was worth dying for, and in doing so, they gave hope to countless others who dreamed the same dream. They pointed toward the horizon, toward the unknown, toward possibility. And that direction was the most revolutionary act of all. In a world that told enslaved people they were nothing, that they had no rights or dignity or future beyond servitude, those shoes declared something different. They said that Mercy Daniels had value, that she had agency, that she had the right to choose her own path. They said that no human being could truly own another, that the spirit couldn't be chained no matter how thoroughly the body was bound, that freedom was not a gift to be given but a birthright to be claimed. The story of Mercy Daniels and her shoes continues to resonate because the struggle for freedom and dignity didn't end with the abolition of slavery. Each generation faces its own battles against injustice and oppression, its own moments when courage is required to step away from what's familiar and walk toward what's possible. In those moments, the image of shoes pointing toward the horizon reminds us that others have walked this path before, that change is possible, that the future belongs to those brave enough to claim it. So the shoes remain, in story if not in fact, waiting at the edges of consciousness, pointing always forward. They are a question and an answer, a challenge and an encouragement, a ghost story and a love song all at once. They whisper to anyone who will listen that freedom is possible, that courage exists, that the horizon is not a boundary but an invitation. And somewhere in memory or spirit or simply in the story we tell ourselves about who we are and what we value, Mercy Daniels still walks, her feet bare and strong, her eyes fixed on that distant horizon, moving forward step by step toward a future she helped create by refusing to accept the world as it was and insisting on the world as it should be. Her shoes pointed the way and countless others followed, each adding their own footsteps to the long march toward justice, each choosing freedom over safety, hope over certainty, the unknown future over the unbearable present. That is the legacy of Mercy Daniels, one slave girl who became legend, who left her shoes as a signpost for all who came after. Not that she was perfect or that her escape solved anything beyond her own immediate situation, but that she tried, that she walked into the darkness trusting that somewhere ahead there was light, that she refused to let her story end in that place of pain and servitude. She wrote her own ending, and in doing so, she gave others permission to write theirs. The shoes still point toward the horizon, in every story that remembers them, in every heart that draws strength from her courage, in every person who decides that freedom is worth fighting for. They point north, They point forward, they point toward tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that, toward a world where every person can walk free and choose their own direction, where shoes point wherever their wearer decides, where the horizon belongs to everyone.